Well, Subbu, welcome to the journey of life. I'm so happy to
Okay.
have you today.
Thank you, thank you. I'm really looking forward, and I think it's going to be a great conversation.
Wonderful. So, Subbu, I wanted to tell my viewers a little bit about you. So, Subbu is a social entrepreneur who co founded Learning Curve Foundation in 2016 after a career spanning 18 years in the corporate and consulting sector. He co founded Learning Curve Foundation to address a key missing element in the educational system today, that of social emotional learning. In the last 4 years, Learning Curve has developed and deployed an innovative programmatic approach to SEL in schools, including SEL curriculum, teacher capacity, and SEL assessment, directly impacting 42,000 children, 10,000 parents, and 1,400 children from underserved backgrounds. Very impressive, Subbu. Tell us a little bit about your early journey.
Sure. So, yes, I'm a Mumbaiker for sure, and I grew up in a very sort of traditional middle class kind of family. My mother was a banker. My father worked for Reliance Industries for the longest time, and I guess very sort of regular sort of childhood. You know, the typical things that you do and you don't do and things like that. Um, and school, I think school was all about the grades, right? I think because my parents always felt, and they were right at that point, of course, that grades are a great way for you to sort of launch yourself into what you need to be, right? And therefore, it was all about grades. So I was actually, you know what, I was actually a very intensely competitive sort of a kid, you know, that I couldn't afford to lose that 1 mark here and there and things like that. So some of my fights with my teachers were absolutely legendary in school. So you know, I was one of those kids. I loved science and I loved English and I used to do a lot of extracurricular work, stuff like that. You know, and you know, that's how the school sort of era sort of went off, and went to college. And when I went to college, you know, one of the things that I realized basically was that well, I might have been the school topper, but when I went into college, there were probably like 200 guys like me. And I said, whoa, okay, that's something that's interesting. I wasn't expecting that, you know. Uh, so yeah, that's sort of part of my life, you know, and that's really how I got into college. And interestingly, I'm a pharmacy graduate. I never wanted to be a pharmacy graduate. Interestingly, I actually wanted to become a neurosurgeon,
Mhm.
of all the things, you know. And funnily enough, basically, I actually scored more marks in the engineering sort of group than in the biology group, which was very weird.
Yeah.
I didn't apply for engineering, which my parents didn't like. And they said, well, you've got more marks there, so you should apply. And I said, no, I don't want to, you know. So couldn't get into a medical college, the government medical college. And so the option is let's do pharmacy, right?
And you were talking a little bit when we talked earlier about your learnings when you actually left India, and what were some of those things that you started to realize as you were doing your graduate work?
So when I joined, when I joined Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, a couple of things hit me sort of straight away, right? Um, one is that how big the world actually is,
Mhm.
because then you know the sheer diversity of people from different lands and different cultures. And I was really not an extrovert. I don't think I still am, right? And I found that I found that I really derived a lot of joy from sort of talking to people from different countries. And you know, so I spent a lot of time with people from different countries rather than just folks from Hyderabad and India, right? And that is one thing that I realized, that I'm really enjoying that. I'm really enjoying the diversity of it all. The second thing that I really, it really struck me is that um, the level of, I think the level of sheer rigor and the level of thinking that you need to be able to apply to a course like that. It was pretty intensive, right? It was pretty intense, and there's a lot of work that you need to do to get by, and grades don't come that easily. So you have to produce original work, you have to do that, you have to do a lot of reading, and I really, really enjoyed that because I just hadn't had that experience at all. So the sheer rigor of it, I was enjoying that. I learned I learned how really, I think a lot of my ability to either write or to even talk basically came from that sort of rigor. So I think my communication skills really, really went up a notch when that. And more importantly, I think I was just learning to embrace things that were new. Right. And I think just doing that, just going through that experience of being in a class with different people and voicing your opinion, writing a different paper, or I worked in a supermarket, um, you know, to sort of fund part of my education. Those were all experiences that I think I just completely sort of enjoyed, and then each of those experiences taught me, in hindsight, of course, that that how how much adaptability matters, how much your ability to be open about what life could be matters, right? And those were some phenomenal sort of learnings that I think came out of that for me.
Yeah. So
Right, and no, absolutely. I think I completely sort of I also resonate with some of those examples, right? Because I think in the learning systems that we were in, especially in school, everything was a very standardized sort of a measure, right? And it's very binary. So all you had to do is basically just get to that sort of mark level or that score level. But when I was in the UK, for example, I remember that that what mattered was not just what you wrote, but also what mattered was how you came up, how you sort of thought through it, how you
yeah.
sort of discovered it, how you've done that. And I've had conversations with my professors when I've gone to them and said, ask a doubt, and they would never answer it directly, and they would ask me another question, and I'm saying, okay, let me try answering that question. So they would then also factor in that effort, right? Because I think there was always appreciation for effort, which is never there in a sort of standardized kind of a schooling system. And honestly, um, I think that really gives you that confidence that you have the ability, you have some of those competencies to be able to do that, to do things that you really never thought you could do.
Right. Right.
But it's unfortunate, that I just wish that, if we actually think through these things and bring them to an early schooling system, then you don't grow up with self-limiting beliefs. You don't grow up believing that one mark is important and not the 99 that you got, right? So it's that, you want to flip that equation a little bit. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of what you were saying earlier was the rational thinking, the ability to do independent thinking, the ability to actually be quite good with critical thinking, you know, and those aspects of human development are somewhat ignored in the education today. So I think we're moving now towards your transition from working in the UK, working in India, and then you deciding that that was not for you. So can you talk a little bit about that transition? You obviously had a very successful career building in the UK. You chose to shift to India. So talk a little bit about those transitions and why those transitions.
Yeah, so no, I think I was building a good career in GSK in the UK. I had a great team. We all worked so well together. It was brilliant to be part of such a team and do some of that good work. Um, and I think about 5-6 years in, just felt that honestly the decision to move back to India was essentially more from a social sort of standpoint. We were in London. London was a very difficult place to sort of live socially.
Mhm.
And family was back here. So, parents were here, everybody was here. And somehow there was this talk that was happening, right? And, we said, okay, let's move back. It's fine. It's not a big deal. we never sort of said we live in the UK for the rest of our lives. We never said that anyway. So we said, okay, let's just go. Honestly, it wasn't something we thought of for like a few months. We just said one day, let's just move back. What's the big deal? And we'll just go, right? And that's what we did, right? And I think sometime in August or September we decided, and in January we were back. It was kind of as simple as that. And then I took some time off. I took some time off basically just to figure out what I wanted to do when I came back to India, because India was still new to me at that point, because it'd been out for 6 years. I think I dabbled in a couple of early sort of entrepreneurial ideas. But then I think honestly nobody in the family had that kind of patience. And there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of pressure mounting. What is this dude doing with his life, right? I think coming back from the UK is one thing, and then sitting around writing business plans that ain't going anywhere is another thing. So, so I said, okay, fine. Let me just sort of pick up a job and see what happens. And that's really how Hyderabad happened. Hyderabad was never on my list at all, because I'm from Mumbai. So I said I want to go back to Mumbai or Pune or Bangalore or one of those places, but life always throws that curveball at you, right? So I ended up in Hyderabad. Dr. Reddy's Labs, great. I think a great company to sort of work with. Had a good starting role, head of supply chain for product development, good sort of starting role, etc. And I think in Dr. Reddy's, I think I went through about 4 or 5 different roles in the 8 odd years I was there. And that was another brilliant, I think hindsight, brilliant experience for me, because every single one of those roles was almost like a blank sheet of paper. And I had this sort of challenge and then almost a thrill of crafting something, whether it was, we started a function called clinical outsourcing, which was a great venture we did. Putting together program management processes for R&D was another sort of exciting sort of thing for me, etc. So did a lot of that sort of thing, right? And I of course it had its moments when I would feel very frustrated about it, and there were moments when I felt I was doing a great job, just the usual sort of a thing, I guess, right? But I think it was sometime in 2000, late 2011, early 2012 that. That just something just sort of went off, and I said, well, not really sort of challenging enough for me, right? I think I need to think about something a little bit more complex. I don't know what that is, but maybe we'll figure that out. Now, it's during that time that Gayatri, my wife, and also the co-founder of Learning Curve now, she was running a pre-primary school. She is a great believer in early education. She wanted to make sure early education is accessible to children who can't really afford it. So she was running a pre-primary school for children from underresourced backgrounds, and got me interested really in what education is all about. And I realized, well, wow, how complex that is, right? And I said, wow, it's a space where there are like a gazillion problems to solve, and we're not even scratching the surface of it. So I said, could that be something that I could give it a shot? And I said, if I can't even do something in 4 or 5 years, I'll just go back and find another job, sort of thing, right? That was a fallback. So that's really how, and honestly, again, that transition happened over a cup of coffee one evening. That's it. It wasn't over 6 months. It wasn't over spreadsheets. And a biggest lesson, I think, for me from a lot of that basically was that always trust your gut. Yes, you need data, sure. You need data, but I think when your gut says something is right, I think it'll usually work. I know there's not too much science behind that, but I do trust my gut when I make a lot of decisions, and a lot of those decisions have worked. Maybe because I had to work at those decisions as well, of course. But so it was over a cup of coffee, really, and we said, let's just do something else, and let's just do this. So I went in there the next day morning and I quit. And my CEO said to me, "What is wrong with you? I mean, if you've got a hangover, work it off, come back." But I said, no, I'm not. I'm fine. I'm sober. I'm making it under, no force, whatever. So, but that's really how that transition happened. And that transition took 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, because once I made that switch, it was important for us to really then understand what are those complexities of the sector, what's really the problem that we want to try and solve for.
Right.
And that took us a good 2 years
Mm-hmm.
to sort of research and understand. And I think it was that research that um, I think laid those foundations for where we are today. Because if we
Yeah.
hadn't studied it well enough, we
Mm.
might not have been able to sort of narrow down and really sort of craft something that we believe is a good solution.
Subbu, it's so interesting in you're talking about trusting your gut, because it's one of those fundamental things that people feel really scared about doing. A lot of the decisions are made with your head or your heart. And I think trusting the gut, trusting your instinct, and then going after what you really want to do is really, really brave. And I think that people who are viewing this, the takeaway message for me is trust your gut, understand that there will be challenges in front of you, and be ready to work through those challenges. Nothing is really impossible because, once you start to figure out what exactly you want to do, it'll take you a bit to figure it out. And it's okay to not know it on that day one. I was listening to a really great podcast by Brene Brown. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she's a speaker who talks a little bit about emotional intelligence. She talks about vulnerability and shame. And uh, I was listening to her, and she talked about this freaking first time, FFT, which is that when you're starting something new, whether you go abroad, you go to a new city, you're starting a new job, it is your first time doing it. And it's okay to feel uncertain. It is okay to have those feelings of anxiety. It's okay for you to realize that you're not going to be good at something the first time you do it, right? Just like riding a bike, you're going to fall off sometime, you'll take off the training wheels, and ultimately you will learn how to ride a bike, right? So she used that analogy, and it really resonated with me because sometimes, in our lives with our educational system, we are used to being very certain about everything. With our family backgrounds, we're used to having a certain amount of security, right? We're good at things, right? And by the time you reach the age that you're talking about, you're used to being competent at things. So starting something new is extremely difficult at that point in time. But remembering that it's the FFT, the freaking first time you're actually doing something, that it's okay to feel that uncertainty, to have the expectation that it will take you some time to get comfortable with it, and also to normalize it, to say, look, this is how it's supposed to be. It's normal to feel uncertain. It's normal to feel like you're not in control. And it's normal for you to take the time to actually learn how to do it. So what you just said was so fitting with what I just heard from Brene Brown. So I just wanted to relate that because I think a lot of people listening to this are probably
Right.
thinking, wow, making a gut decision, taking 2 years to
Yeah.
figure it out, right? That is very gutsy.
Yeah. I just want to maybe just add one point to that, right? And I think what's important when you trust your gut basically is that you're not really afraid of failing,
Hmm.
because you're okay to say that, well, doesn't work. I'll either find a way to make it work,
Yeah,
but I will not be subdued by this fear of failure.
right.
And that's so critical. That's so critical, right? Because it's like just like learning to ride a bike, because then you fall off 100 times before you actually learn how to do it. But somehow it's okay to fall off a bike when you're learning, but it's not okay to fail otherwise.
Right.
That's sort of the paradox that's there, isn't it?
When you grow
It's kind
up,
of weird, right?
yeah, no, and as adults, the other thing that struck me is when you're learning to ride a bike, your parents don't say, if you don't learn how to ride the bike in 1 month, you're no longer part of my family, you know? So what's the worst that can happen if you fail? If you fail, you're just learning. And I really think that the point of all of this is that maybe you will fall several times off the bike. Maybe it will not come to you in a month. Maybe it will not even come to you. It took me 8 tries to learn how to swim, but I did learn ultimately, and each time that I did it, I was very, very scared, right? So I think this whole point of what you're talking about failure, as human beings, when we fail, we dust ourselves off, we get up, and we try again. And if you failed with anything in your life, you know that you have the capability of getting up, dusting yourself off, getting back up on the saddle or on that bike, riding it again, trying it again, right? So this thing about
Absolutely.
failure that holds us back from achieving our dreams, from doing something new, which we may not be good at, right? That we may fail at, and then not pursuing our gut for the fear of failure is probably what keeps most people from doing what they really want to do.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think, and I completely agree with it. And I think that we don't have to really teach children to fail, but I think we need to teach them how to fail with grace and dignity, and how to take those learnings and how to make something better of it.
Subbu, when you were going through this process of deciding within the educational field, within the early education field of what you wanted to pursue, how did you how did you chance upon, or how did you decide to follow this social emotional learning versus something else?
Yeah, so I think two things, right? I think one was the research sort of seemed to indicate that, in the sense that we spoke to a lot of educators in India. We spoke to schools and professors and psychologists, and everybody seemed to point at it, at least, right? And saying basically that, well, children don't know how to behave. Some people would say children don't have the skills to socially be interactive. So a lot of different ways of wording that, and honestly, I think the terminology of social emotional learning was never clear at that point, right?
Hmm.
But we
Yeah.
were gathering this and saying it doesn't seem to be related to math or English or physics. It seems to be very different. It seems to be in a
Mhm.
different sort of sphere altogether, right? So that was one thing that was there. But I think the actual trigger came from a volunteering stint that we did, me and Gayatri did, at a girls' home in Hyderabad.
Mhm.
It was a shelter home, about 40 sort of orphan and semi-orphan girls. And when we just walked in there, on a Sunday, saying, well, let's make a little better use of our Sundays, and we said, let's go and volunteer there and see what they need. And the caretakers there said, the caregivers there said, that these children are really struggling with their subjects. They're not really doing well in school.
Mhm.
Can you help them out? And we said, sure, we will do what we can. And we said, we started working with them on their, subjects and things like that. Uh, 3 months in, and 3 months in, honestly, nothing was happening. And we just felt that we're going there every Sunday, but we're not even scratching the surface of it all, right? And
Yeah.
somewhere in turn, we also began to feel that maybe I don't even think that these girls even trust us, and uh, we can see so many different things happening. We couldn't figure it out.
Mhm.
Then we decided to have a more deeper chat with the caregivers and try and understand what was really happening with these girls. What's their story? Where do they come from, right? And that's not a question that we had asked before. And when we asked that question, we heard stories that were very chilling for us.
Mhm.
A lot of these girls had gone through violence in their lives. They'd
Mhm.
gone through trauma. They'd gone through abuse. They were there because a single parent just basically said, I don't want to take care of you because I can't financially manage your school, so I'm going to put you in there and not bother you about you, right?
Right.
And
Mhm.
when that happens to children who are, particularly in that 8 years, 6 years to 14 years of age, it does a lot to you.
Mm-hmm.
And what was happening with these girls was precisely that, because then essentially they had lost their sense of self-worth.
Mm-hmm.
They began to believe that they're not worth anything, which is why they've been abandoned, right? Which is why
Mm-hmm.
they're there.
Wow.
They began to believe that the only way for me to basically make a difference or to even be heard is to be aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other way for me to relate to the world, because that is how I can protect myself.
Mm-hmm.
To protect myself against what the world has done to me, I have to be aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
When I manifest my insecurities and I manifest my sort of lack of self-esteem in those ways, you then don't build strong relationships. So they did not relate to anything around them. They were like almost very, I think in some ways there were some of them who were almost detached,
Mm-hmm.
and you can feel that. You can't really see it, but you can feel it.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, wow. And if that's happening with them, if that's happened to them, then why on earth are we teaching them physics?
Mm-hmm.
What's the point of doing that?
Yeah.
Right? We said, no, that's not going to work. So we said, let's not even do that. Let's put all the books aside, and let's take some of that research that we did. Let's understand how to be mentors to them, how to be friends with them, how to get them to relate, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what we did. And honestly, that's all we did. Every Sunday for a year,
Mm-hmm.
we went half a day, and we would just sit there, swap stories, life in the universe kind of conversations, and
Yeah.
slow little things about them building themselves, and getting better at what they do, thinking about themselves as better. I
Mm-hmm.
think fishing out some of that potential that they had, etc. And then we really saw things happen.
Mm-hmm.
6 months in, we were seeing um, small changes, in the way that they would behave with the younger children. Small things in which, the ways in which they would talk and communicate, the way that they would be able to express themselves. We saw all of that kind of changing. And very interestingly, we also saw their academic grades going up. Uh, and we said, whoa, this is very interesting, because we'd never actually taught them physics, but they were doing pretty decently at, English and math and physics, right? And we then realized that the correlation is very clear. The correlation is that if your self is strong, if you believe, if you have the skills to work with that, if you're able to build healthier relationships, if you're able to relate well, if you're able to navigate around yourself and others with you, work with your peers,
Yeah.
then I think you've put yourself in a position where you're better equipped
Mm-hmm.
to sort of deal with what life has to throw at you,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And that's really what I think, that's really what sealed it for us.
Yeah.
And I
So
said,
it was really the self-esteem, right? It's what you think about yourself that really impacts a child's growth, and their ability to really learn. Um, the things that you said about, really going and talking to them, understanding their stories, where they were coming from, relating to them on a person to person basis, made them think that you see them, actually see them, that they were not discarded, right? As they were feeling, that you were hearing them, that what they said mattered to you. And those three things of I hear you, I see you, and whatever you're saying matters to me, is, I think, the fundamental of building that self-esteem in that child. You were mentioning the age group of 6 to 14 years, Subbu. That Why that age group? Why is it important to build that social and emotional connections during that time?
for a couple of, I think for a couple of reasons, right? Because the age group of 6 to 14 is where the maximum number of psychological inflection points actually happen.
Hmm.
Uh, for example, a child's self-identity really forms between the age of 6 to 10.
Hmm.
So, for example, at age 6, the child doesn't really see himself or herself as different from the world.
Hmm.
But when the child becomes 8, they start to see themselves as, hey, this is me and this is the world. So
Hmm.
they start to see that difference, right? And by the time they're 10, majority of their aspects of self-identity sort of start to get cemented, right? So in that age, if they're constantly told that you're wrong, this is not good enough, you're not worth it,
Mhm.
right? You then basically form a very negative self-image. But
Mhm.
if you're appreciated for effort, if you're encouraged, your self-identity then changes. Ultimately, it's like three circles, right?
Mhm.
Um, your first up to 10 years is basically about yourself.
Mhm.
Yourself has to be built at that time.
Mhm.
Uh, then between that 11 and 12 is basically where you realize that, hey, I've got actually friends, and I want to make friends. I want to start dealing with them. I want to start working with my friends. I want to start exchanging stories and things like that. So that's the second circle of when your friendships and your relationships sort of start to build.
Mhm.
Then when you're in the adolescent age, you're 13, 14, and so on, you start to then look at the world and you say, why is that happening in the world? Why is it that I'm treated like this when I'm a girl, and why is it that he's treated like that when I'm a boy? You start to
Mhm.
form those opinions about society, right? And you start to then find your place in the world
Mhm. Mhm.
around that time,
Yeah.
which is why adolescence is also an extremely confusing and extremely sort of turbulent time, because you're trying to find your identity, you're trying to find your place,
Mhm.
right? So if you see that age, right, there are these multiple inflection points that happen in the development, in the
Mhm.
psychological development, that we just simply can't ignore.
Mhm.
Because and it's almost like there's stacks, right? Because it's like, if I don't build the self, I clearly impact on my ability to actually work with my peers. If I don't do that, I don't find my place in society. So when I'm out there into the world, I either I'm a misfit, because I can't find myself my place, and I
Yeah.
react in one of two ways. I either withdraw from the world or I become aggressive about it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really why I think that's a absolutely crucial age to look at some of this.
Right. So creating that foundation of the self is very, very important. It actually creates then the emotional bonding as well as the ability to regulate and self regulate yourself across the various circumstances that you may come across, different kinds of people relating to them, your own relationships, whether at home or in society, then get formulated from that. So, for today's educational system stands very much in favor of building the educational base from the traditional subjects, math, science, English, and the other subjects, right? Um, I have not heard too much about how do you incorporate social and emotional learning into the school system. And I think primarily because traditionally the values, the relating to people, your morals were coming from families, right? So you were supposed to develop this at home, parents were supposed to do this job, and then you were supposed to go to school to learn the basics of what you needed to know from an educational standpoint. So how do you reconcile that?
So I think what was probably true about 30, 40 years back, when a lot of this could happen at home.
Hmm.
I mean, even taking sort of the joint family, right, where basically I think there would be a lot of collaboration, there would be a lot of conflict, and people would learn how to sort of manage that.
Yeah.
A lot of that used to happen, but basically I think not the world has significantly changed, obviously, right? And it has become far more complex, it
Hmm.
has become far more connected, it has become far more complex. And what has happened today also is basically that I think parents have I'm maybe using this, I don't mind using this, but I think parents have outsourced you know the upbringing of their children to a school.
Hmm.
They expect the school to do everything, the
Hmm.
school expects the parent to do everything, so ultimately nobody does anything. Right? Except for the sort of the traditional sort of stuff, right? And I think and I think that is where the need for something like this, I think, not just needs to be in the education system, but also needs to be taken home.
Hmm.
I think there is need, there is a need for us to reconcile it in both places, right? I think it's
Yeah.
almost you need to bridge that in both places and find a way to get it into schools, certainly, because that's a huge part of the child's life, but also find a way to, make its way home as well. And that's really where I think we need to find ways to reconcile it. It's a particularly complex, difficult, and abstract thing to even do.
Right, right, exactly. So what you're saying is a seamless, looking at the child as having a seamless environment, whether at home, in school. They, of course, they're going to be on the internet a lot. So we just need to make sure that no matter what touch points there are for these children, that at every given point in time, not only are we educating them on the traditional subjects that are being taught in school, etc., but that their social and emotional well-being is being developed at the same time, so that the complete human being that is developing from that child, that will go into the adulthood to do what they are supposed to do to be productive in society, that actually happens, and that we're not leaving it to chance. I mean, I'm sure that parents, want to do the right thing for their children. They want to give them the values, they want to give them the morals, they want to teach them things, but there are so many influences outside of the home that are also impacting the children.
Correct. And exactly. And I think that is where we can't leave it to chance, right? Because 30 years ago, the level of those kind of influences, whether it's peer pressure, whether it's social media, were hardly there, right? Were hardly there. And therefore, this was far more sort of controlled environment in that
Yeah,
sense, right? For the child to
yeah.
grow up in. And therefore, there was a lot of balance. But today, you don't have that balance, right?
I
Today,
mean, the
you
level
see
of
so
social
many
media
challenges there.
bullying. I mean, when you used to go to school in the non-social media times, it was enough to be bullied by your peers or your seniors, and now the bullying is actually happening
Exactly.
on social media as well. And the anxiety that a child
Exactly.
feels in today's environment, the amount of emotional distress that might be happening for children in very safe and secure homes. Actually, we're not even talking
Yeah.
about the underserved communities. We're talking about the general sort of environment that we're in, where parents may be working, nuclear families, right? A lot of influence of social media and the internet on these children. I cannot understate the importance of what you're saying, and the importance of actually bringing the SEL curriculum. Subbu, can you talk a little bit now about the work that Learning Curve Foundation is doing in building that curriculum for SEL? It's an abstract to me right now, but
Mhm.
could you make it a little bit more real about what that curriculum actually brings to these schools that you're working with?
Sure, sure. So I'll sort of talk about two things, right? One is basically the approach itself
Mhm.
of how the work happens, how it happens, right? And then basically talk quickly about the curriculum itself, right? Um, so the approach to this, to bringing social emotional learning to schools and to homes, is basically through a capacity building model.
Mhm.
uh, what we said basically is that if we can build the capacity of every stakeholder who influences the child,
Mhm.
whether it's the teachers, the
Yeah.
school administration in the school, and then the parents at home, if
Right.
you are able to do that, so almost take a 360 view on it,
Mhm.
then basically we will ensure that the child receives all of that in an appropriate manner, and therefore is sort of more holistically looked at as a child, right? So that is one part of the approach,
Mhm.
and we felt that that's a more sustainable way of looking at it, because then you want to make sure that when you are not there, we're still a third party, right?
Mhm.
We're still an organization, we're still an external organization in a school or a system. We're
Yeah.
not the system,
Right.
and therefore it needs to be part of the system. So
Mhm.
what we need to do is build that into the system, right? So that's the approach that we took.
Okay.
That's the model, and that model has its own difficulties, because then it takes more time, it takes more effort, there are more ups and downs, right? So that is one. Secondly, from a curriculum standpoint, basically we've sort of distilled out. There are close to 200 odd frameworks of social emotional learning globally,
Mhm.
that are there, and a lot of them have been used in different sort of contexts, etc. Uh, there were a couple of frameworks that have been particularly well established. The World Health Organization had a life skills framework. CASEL in the US is one of the most sort of advanced organizations who talks about it, and they have a framework as well. So we drew most of our work from these two frameworks.
Okay.
And when we look at social emotional learning as a part of, almost as for the child, it is basically a combination of 5 different umbrella competencies. Uh, One is self-awareness. The second is self-management. The third is social awareness. Fourth is healthy relationships. And the fifth is responsible decision making. Under each of these, we developed a set of building blocks. So what does self-awareness actually mean? So we said what self-awareness means is the ability, for example, of a child to be aware of and develop one's own strengths, and the ability to sort of recognize some of the limitations, etc. So we made that definition, and then we said, okay, what does self-awareness mean for age 6? What does it mean for 7, 8, 9, 10? Because it means different things, right? Because a child at 6 years, self-awareness could just simply mean awareness of his or her own body.
Right.
Whereas at 13 or 14, self-awareness is about identity, it's about perception. It gets more and more complex. So we then built it out that way, right? We went all the way from age 6 to age 15, and we figured out, through research, there is literature available. So we started putting that together, and then we did that for all the five competencies, right? Okay. And that's how the curriculum came in. We then use that curriculum to develop material, lesson plans, and toolkits. The idea was, how does a teacher take it? How does a teacher use it in the classroom? And we were able to give teachers a set of lesson plans, tools, engagement sort of resources, etc., that a teacher could then start using in the school, both as standalone versions or also within certain subjects, right?
Right.
A simple example of that basically is that we said, always start your day with a simple check-in. Always start a new period with a check-in, right? You can do it standalone if you want. You can do that every period if you want.
Yeah.
Give the school, a little bit of a mood chart sort of a thing, right? And we tell the teacher, well, after lunch break, when your kids come back, basically ask them, they have ice cream sticks with their name written on it, and let them go and put it in whatever they feel like doing, whatever they feel like at that point. And if your class is tired, don't start a new subject. Do something simpler, get them in there, So very simple strategies, right? So we give them strategies, we give them those tools. And that's how the sort of whole curriculum kind of evolved. So today we have a curriculum for teachers, for teacher SEL, because the analogy is, you can't teach swimming through a textbook. So a teacher's own SEL has to be nurtured and protected first. So there's a teacher SEL curriculum, there's a student SEL curriculum, and there's a school SEL curriculum. Okay. And there's a set of resources for parents. So for us, curriculum is across for all of them. Right. And there's different ways in which that sort of gets delivered.
So there's a whole support system that you're creating for that child, whether it's the school, whether it is the teachers or the parents, to be able to support that and increase their capacity, their own capability of actually supporting the child. So basically the impact of all of this is, you're teaching them life skills, emotional balance, ethical discernment, through these 5 pillars in a way. Working with the school systems, what are some of the challenges you face, Subbu? Because the work that you're doing is so important. It is so fundamental to our societies working efficiently and happily and collaboratively in the future. How do you raise children to be able to solve the issues and have better lives than people are having today?
Honestly, I think the only way, at least one of the only ways, is to ensure that this is just part of the school system, because this has to happen there. I mean, it needs to happen at home, sure, but I think school is a great way to do it, because the school has the structure, it has the resources, it has the channels, right? And education system has all of those channels that are possible to be able to do this at you know a certain scale, so that it actually impacts all of those children, right? Uh, a challenge when you asked that question, right? I think one of the first things that came to mind for me was that the problem with, or not a problem, right, but a challenge with social emotional learning basically is that you can't really, um, it's like saying basically that the larger exam is life itself, right? So for somebody to believe that what you're saying actually even makes sense, they'll say, when can I see the results of this? And you're saying, well, wait till the kid gets out of school, right? And he's saying, I don't want to wait for that long. You're saying,
Yeah.
well, it takes time, right? It takes time, it takes effort. So because it's a bit abstract, because there is no, I can't come up with a score, right? I can't come up with a score for a for a child and say, hey, A in self-awareness. You can't do that, right? And it
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to do that
Right.
because because you're talking about behavior, personality, and all of that. These things fluctuate. There's a spectrum always, right? So the biggest challenge for us was essentially trying to convince people that, hey, this is actually of value,
Hmm.
and you need to have a bit of patience. You need to be able to sort of invest time, invest effort, invest resources into be able to doing that, etc. Right? And I think that was the I think the biggest challenge, and I think that continues to be our challenge, because everybody just wants results, and you just want standardized sort of test scores that take your child from grade 1 to grade 2 to grade 3 and so on, right? And we're still stuck in
Yeah.
that mindset. So that mindset is something that is a large sort of challenge. I imagine that's not just the case in India. I know that's the case in the US as well, and probably globally, right? Because why do we see so many spikes in juvenile crime? Why do we see so many instances of teenage depression and all of that, right? And all of this is going back to some
Yeah,
of that, right?
absolutely.
We need to,
Yeah. No, I
yeah,
think
yeah,
what you're pointing out is that, um, life is an infinite game, right? It's the game itself is to live a healthy, happy, productive life, and there is no end to it till your life actually ends, right? So it's really a mindset shift, from going playing Monopoly, where somebody's a winner and somebody's a loser, right? That's what the grade system really is about, which is that you're going to be put on a bell-shaped curve. There are going to be some kids who will be topping, and then there'll be some who will be at the bottom of the class, and then you can put people in compartments, because you can say, oh yeah, this person, these quartile of people belong in the upper quartile, and these are the lower quartile, right? So we're used to sort of proving the success of a program or of anything through grading mechanisms. So I think the challenge that you're pointing out is, how do we see life as uh, as something that is an infinite game, and really the end is to perpetuate a positive, healthy life where adults are fully capable of managing themselves, managing the communities around them, and the society around them, which is really to the benefit of the long term of the society, rather than a quick fix or a quick grade, or something like that. So people who are listening to this are probably thinking, well, how can I help? How do I help overcome some of these challenges for my children who are at home, maybe our families, our communities? So how can people help, Subbu, to encourage SEL in schools and the work that you're doing?
so I think that there's there's a great need for I think there's a great need to, first of all, create an identity for social emotional learning in sort of in education as well as at home.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and uh, and I think if I had to sort of say how people could help, more than just say our work, I think we should say basically, how can we help SEL become real,
Mm-hmm.
and how one of the ways in which they can do this, right, basically, is to really try and dig a little deep into their own their own sort of journeys as individuals, right? And you'll realize that what a lot of what got you here was because either you consciously or accidentally developed a set of social and emotional competencies.
Mm-hmm.
Your everything that you learned otherwise technically only got you to a certain point.
Right.
And the moment you realize that, some of those examples of how you were treated as a child, when you look back into those, when you look sort of almost inward, right, and you then realize that you need to be able to bring those out for your child, right, and you need to start seeing your children as um, not objects in a school that come back with report cards, but children that have identities, children that have personalities, children that have quirks, and children that have interests and likes and dislikes and all of that. And all of that you need to embrace as a parent. As a
Mm-hmm.
teacher, you need to embrace that. You need to be able to embrace the individuality.
Mm-hmm.
And we, as adults, simply need to bring a little bit more of that empathy, simply need to sort of dig into our own lives and say, hey, what did we learn and how are we going to help the child learn that? How
Mm-hmm.
do we enable this child to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's all it takes. I have this great analogy by Sir Ken Robinson, right, who said that, uh, teachers are like gardeners. You can't make children basically, create the optimal conditions in
Yeah.
which they grow. As long as you do that, that's all you need to do, right? And if you do that, then you've just brought SEL into the flow of life. I think that's really what I would say.
Yeah, no, I mean, you talk about the ideal situation where adults have looked into themselves, they figured out, what they went through and then helped their children get that SEL support, whether in school or at home. But I think the real need for the curriculum that I've heard from you is that in our busy lives, in the day to day of living the way we are today, there isn't an opportunity, there isn't that support system for parents, for the teachers, or for the schools to be able to do this work. And I think this is why the work that you're doing is so foundational. To be able to bring that capacity to schools, to the teachers, as well as to the parents, is, I feel, the first step forward in the right direction. I think if I look at the short, mid, and long term ambition, if I may, from just listening to you, it is to set that curriculum up to date, to really get that accepted as the way of doing things in the midterm, right? So it becomes almost a norm that everyone's doing. And then, of course, in the long term, as the next generation of children who are going through this curriculum actually grow up, they will have the capability with their children and with the future generations to actually live it, right? They are not going to need a curriculum because they would have lived through that sort of self-emotional, and the well-being that they would have experienced as children would enable them to then live as very comfortable, happy, and emotionally balanced adults, and be able to then bring the next generations along as well. So I think that what you've just articulated is probably the legacy that I see the work that you're doing leaving, which leaves me
I,
actually a great segue into the next question, which is what legacy do you want to leave with the
I
work
am
that
I
you're
am
doing?
a bit of an I am a bit of an idealist. So and I think honestly I think that's probably the legacy that I want to be able to sort of leave behind, right? And I think
Yeah.
say that we managed to sort of uh, create a create a pathway for social emotional learning to be part of a larger system, to be
Yeah.
part of a system, to be part of an environment in which children sort of grow, right? I
Mhm.
think to me, if you were able to do that, if you were able to do that even 1/10 of what we believe is necessary, I think that's a good legacy to sort of leave behind. I think, yeah, you're right. But I am an idealist, so yeah, so.
You want to get there very fast. Now, of course, the underserved communities are, we have several of them, obviously, across the world. They are unable to fund work such as this. Schools are barely surviving. Teachers are barely surviving through those school systems in underserved communities. So, Subbu, what work are you doing with the underserved communities? and schools?
Yeah. So, and I mean, so should I talk particularly about sort of during this time, the
Yeah,
pandemic?
yeah. I mean, the work that you're doing during this time, and then otherwise your,
Yeah.
the standard work that you're doing as well.
Right. So, I mean, uh, well, pre-COVID, basically the program that we used to run would basically be sort of with a particular school. We work with two types of schools. One are what are called as a low-fee, unaided schools that are
Mhm.
in the private category, but they charge very, very low fees because they cater to children from low-income backgrounds. That is one type of school. So they don't get any government funding, they don't get any private funding, etc. So they're all very small, very well-meaning people who want to sort of do something for their community. So they sort of set up a community school,
Yeah.
and then they try and run it with whatever meager sort of funds. That is one. And second is the government schools, or the more public schools that are there, etc. So we work with both. We work with sort of both categories, and in each of those we use a slightly different model, slightly different approach. Whereas in the sort of low fee schools, the approach is to sort of be more intensive in terms of support, to be able to try more innovative things, etc. So that we are able to create more depth of impact.
Mhm. Mhm.
Whereas in government schools, we run what we call as a demonstration lab, that we run for a couple of years time. Again, the idea would be to basically sort of figure out what is working in that particular system, and then scale that within the government system to try and inject it into existing channels that the government already has. So, for
Mhm.
example, if there is a teacher training program that the government has, then we try and find a way in which our teacher SCL effort sort of gets bolted onto the teacher training modules that the government has, so that at some point the government then takes it up, and then do that, right? So that's how
So
we
basically,
look at
through that
scaling it.
module, for example, they would train the government teachers on this whole approach so that when they get into the
Exactly.
classroom, there is a particular impact in how they are managing that classroom, how they're teaching the children, how they're managing the esteem of the children, as well as their emotional and
Correct.
social well-being. Okay.
Correct, absolutely. And for each of these, we have different support models where we have a field team that goes in there once a month, talks to the teachers, has sort of learning circles with them, supports them,
Mhm.
makes them feel valued and respected, etc. So the teachers don't see this as a burden.
Mhm.
So we do a lot of that developmental work in the schools as well, so that we see the teacher, the school environment, the student, everything sort of working in tandem, right? And I think
Mhm.
that's sort of the primary approach, and that's been the approach for the last 2 or 3 years that we've refined. Uh, During the pandemic, of course, basically things changed significantly, so we're no longer able to access schools.
Yeah.
So during the lockdown period that happened, basically what we did really was use a lot of our curriculum and actually created a different set of emotional well-being resources that we started disseminating through various means. We started disseminating them through WhatsApp. We started disseminating them through schools.
Mhm.
We did that through government departments, etc. So we sort of reached about. We were able to reach about 10,000 odd students and their families during that lockdown period, and that's a pretty small number,
Mhm.
simply because access to the student databases, contact information, etc., was very limited.
Mhm.
So we were able to do that. But that's what one of the responses that we had. The second thing that we've done very recently was basically we said that, well, if we can't take SEL to the school through the
Mhm.
primary program, why don't we take it home?
Mhm.
So we then actually pretty much created a program called Connect at Home,
Yeah.
created a different set of toolkits around social emotional learning that a child and a parent could work on together, or a child could even work on independently.
Mhm.
And given the challenge with sort of devices, etc., we chose not to give it through a device, but we said we'll give it physically. So
Mhm.
we've actually printed those toolkits, and we
Okay.
worked with schools, local administration, gone down almost every channel possible to basically make sure that these toolkits actually
Mhm.
reach the children. And then we've set up a sort of a calling voice. It's a cloud-based voice service that we use to basically call the children's numbers or parents' numbers twice a week, with a motivational message for the children. We've come up with some, well-being checks that we're doing with the parents every fortnight, etc. So we've almost crafted a different sort of way a different primary program in that sense.
Yeah.
But we said that, well, we can't, and this is a time, I think, when social emotional learning becomes even more sort of relevant, right? Because children are at home, they're isolated, their anxiety levels are high, they don't have access to any sort of schooling or quality content, etc. They don't have that. Parents are under tremendous financial pressure because of their low income sort of backgrounds, and all of that is adding up to even more psychological adversity. So we said we've got to find a way to make that happen. So I think we are over the next couple of months, we're reaching out to about 12,000 such children through these physical toolkits, etc. So that's been what's keeping us awake at night for the last few weeks.
Right. So a lot of sort of reach out through paper-based SEL curriculums, going to children's homes where they can work on it with their parents or with themselves, and really trying to make sure that through this process, especially for low income and underserved sort of communities that may not have access to online learning, that they have at least something that they can work on together. So this is really very meaningful, Subbu, in this time. I think the biggest fear has been that everybody has been talking about online learning, but not all communities are served through online learning. Not everybody has equal and equitable access to education during this time. This has been highlighted probably more significantly through the pandemic than ever before. So the work that you've done so far to connect the dots has probably been very meaningful. How many children were you trying to reach? Ideally, if you could, if you had the right funding levels, how many children would be needing this curriculum in your area? Because obviously India is very big, but just in Hyderabad and the surrounding areas, how many children ideally would you like to reach, and how many have you reached so far through this effort?
So actually, ideally, I mean, if I was just talking about even the areas where we work, even if I was looking at that, that would easily be about 100,000 children who I think would absolutely be necessary for us to be able to sort of reach out. We are hoping to be able to reach out to about 12 to 15,000 of them with the sort of current visibility of funding that we have. That's what we can do realistically for now at least. And again, for that also, basically, I think we're still trying to raise funding. When COVID happened, quite a bit of our funding commitment sort of dropped out. A lot of that happened to many organizations, and we were one of those. So so we're sort of crowdsourcing, trying to get as much as we can, etc. But yeah, I mean, I think we're hopeful that at least that 12-15,000 children will be able to sort of reach out to, and hopefully find ways to reach that 150,000 children who I think definitely will sort of need this. Yeah.
Subbu, if we wanted to contribute to the effort, what's the best way for people to connect to the Learning Curve Foundation?
So I mean, we're currently running a campaign. So we've got a fundraising page up that we can do, and people
is it
can
on
simply
Facebook
sort of
or
donate.
where is it?
No, it's not on Facebook. It's a separate sort of payment page that we've created. We didn't do it through Facebook or through another fundraising portal because their fees are quite high. So we decided to use a sort of a different, it's a payment gateway basically. It's a Razorpay sort of payment gateway that we're using, and people can donate through that link. A constraint for us right now, I think, is that we can't accept foreign funds. So all donations will have to be made in Indian rupees. That's sort of a constraint, but I think it's not too bad. I mean, I think a lot of our friends have found ways to route it through Indian sort of bank accounts, either their own or through their friends. Some of them have
Right.
pooled it, etc. So,
Mhm.
so right now we're running a fairly massive sort of campaign
Mhm.
to try and raise some of that, and yeah, it's been a decent start, but I think we have a long sort of way to go though. Yeah, yeah.
Listen, this is, first of all, thank you for doing what you're doing. This is so meaningful for children and our next generations to grow up as well balanced, emotionally happy, and collaborative and productive human beings. So, very, very good work being done. Of course, our underserved communities require it a lot, given the circumstance that these children are coming from. But also, I feel that there is a lot of applicability across the education system for all children, actually. You are doing work internationally as well, connecting with other organizations that are also doing this work. Um, I'm hoping that this work actually catches the imaginations of educators in India and worldwide, and actually is able to bring the benefits of SEL learning.
Yep, I hope so. I certainly hope so too, and that's going to be what is going to keep us restless and awake at night for the next few years for sure, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, no, and I think we should all be sort of impatient to get this SEL curriculum across the world. I think there is an impatience required in people who are interested in education, and especially interested in the early childhood education of the ages that you were mentioning. So thank you for the work that you're doing, Subbu, and this was really a very enlightening conversation. Thank you for being on the journey of life.
Thank you for having me on the journey of life. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think I've relived quite a few quite a few good moments from my life as well. So it's always nice to sort of reminisce a little bit about that. So thank you once again for having me on this.
Thank you, Subbu.